In this video, I want to focus exclusively on Active Directory integration with Hue. Hue is a great service for providing end-user access to a Hadoop cluster for things like running and testing queries and browsing files and running some basic simple jobs. So far in this setup, I have one instance of Cloudera Manager. I've used Cloudera Director to spin up a cluster. I haven't done anything with respect to Kerberizing this cluster yet, but it doesn't matter with respect to Hue. You can run it against a Kerberized cluster or an unkerberized cluster, and the steps on this video will be the same. If you've been running through the Active Directory Kerberization video, you can keep going. If you're working with MIT Kerberos, you can keep working with that cluster, but you should spin up an Active Directory server at this time and come back to us on this. There's other videos on using this Cloudera Director setup to work with Active Directory, so I refer you to those. In this setup, I have a fresh cluster. I've stopped the cluster, and I've added a gateway node to this cluster. Basically, what I did is I went over to service by service, and I allocated gateway roles to host 79. So these are all allocated as gateway roles. There's another video where I walk through how to do that, and I refer you to that if you need help setting that up. I've also copied a hosts file to every node in the cluster, and that host file refers to the Active Directory server by its domain name, so I don't need to refer to that in future instances. That host file refers to the Active Directory server by its host name rather than IP address, so I don't need to worry about these long IP addresses that Amazon gives me. So now I'm going to add a Hue instance to this cluster. So I'm going to go to Add a Service. Hue requires Uzi, so I'm going to add Uzi first. And Hue requires Uzi because there's a job designer in there that lets you drag and drop nodes to create jobs and workflows. And I'm going to just select the list of dependencies that shows every service on the cluster. And I'm going to make sure Uzi is running on the same server that I have gateway. And I'm not too concerned about the Uzi service right now, so I'm just going to accept the defaults for the database configuration. During the first run of the Add Service Wizard, the cluster services are going to start. I'm going to go ahead and leave the page with this first run. Will continue to run later. So as you can tell, I can click on running commands and see my first run. So we've successfully added the Uzi service, which is a requirement for Hue because Hue has an Uzi job designer application included in it. So now we can add Hue as well. So I'm going to go to Actions and Add a Service from the top Cloudera Manager menu. And I'm going to select a Hue service. And I'm going to select all of the dependencies that are required. And I'm going to provide the gateway host that we've been running as the Hue server. I want to make sure I exclusively select that gateway host. And we're going to let the first run run. This will start all of the services that have not started yet, as well as the Hue service. So I now have a successfully running Hue service. I'm going to click on the Hue web UI and do a first login onto Hue. Hue is configured by default to have the first login be the super user or the admin user for Hue. So I'm going to go ahead and invent a user here. So I'm going to use the user admin and the password. And here I'm logged into Hue. I'm going to go over to admin and I'm going to go over to manage users. There are a couple of different ways to coordinate with LDAP with Hue. One is LDAP synchronization. So I can click add user and you can synchronize users from LDAP. And there's a documentation on that. However, I am going to just use LDAP authentication for Hue. So that will make it so that anytime I try to log into Hue, it's going to go and automatically go over to my LDAP server to log in as those end users. Super useful, very low maintenance, and easy to do. First, I'm going to go over to my LDAP server, and I'm going to add a couple of users. So I am in the Active Directory Users and Computers interface of Active Directory. And I'm just going to add a user, and I'm going to add user 1. And I'm going to make sure the password never expires, and I'm going to give it a password of password. And this is Windows, so I'm using a capital P and a 0 and an exclamation point. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to add user 2 and user 3. Okay, so I've added now 3 users to LDAP, or Active Directory in this case, user 1, user 2, and user 3. And now I can go and authenticate them with Hue after some configuration in Cloudera Manager. So I'm going to pop over to my configuration tab on my Hue service, and I'm going to look for LDAP. And I'm going to walk through some different configurations. One is Hue gives you a number of different authentication backends that you can use. So you can authenticate against everything. You can authenticate against the model using model backend, PAM, Spinego, Django. We are going to use the LDAP backend. So these are just interchangeable authentication modules that you can use with Hue. I encourage you to read more about it if you're super interested. The LDAP URL we're going to use is LDAP-S, hadoop-ad.hadoopsecurity.local. This is the same entry that I put into the hosts file on the Hue server. I actually put it on every node in the cluster, but in this case, I only need it on the Hue server. I'm not going to use search bind authentication here. What search bind authentication does is it will enter an LDAP search for the username that you enter in, and it will find the closest one that matches and then attempt to bind to that one when you authenticate. I prefer explicit authentication. I want the username to be exactly what I enter, not just whatever I'm searching for. Make sure TLS is enabled and create LDAP users on login. What this means is when I log into Hue, if that user doesn't exist on the Hue side, it's going to go ahead and populate that user with the information it gets from LDAP. We do use LDAP search for other functionality, so we do need to have a base domain setting. So I'm going to say Hadoop-AD. We've got TLS, we've got create LDAP, we've got the LDAP backend. And then I need the LDAP bind user and the LDAP bind password. So this is the user when we log in. What user is Hue going to log in as when it tries to do this? I've added the user Cloudera Manager to this for the demo where we turn on Kerberos authentication with Active Directory. I'm going to use that same user here. That's just a user that I've added with the username of CM, the password of password, and I ran the delegate control wizard on that user to give them admin rights over the group, although that's not required for Hue. Walking through the configs again that I've changed, I've enabled the LDAP backend. I've added the LDAP URL. I've turned on Start TLS and create LDAP users on login. I've entered in the LDAP search base for the domain that I'm using, and that's Hadoop-AD, Hadoop security, and local. I've specified the LDAP bind user and the LDAP bind password. And we're going to scroll up and save our changes. And we have an error for the NT domain or LDAP username password. This is Active Directory. The LDAP username pattern is for non-Active Directory LDAP authentication. Since we're using Windows, we're going to use an NT domain. The reason this error came up is because my search key here was LDAP. And if I pop in NT, I'll see the NT domain here. Let's be a little more specific. And the NT domain that I'm going to use is hadoopsecurity.local. And then we need to just save and restart Hue. Now that the Hue service is restarting, I'm going to come back to my primary window, and the Hue service has restarted. I'm going to click on the Hue Web UI. And as you can see, it's telling you here on the quick start that it's logging in to LDAP. I'm going to enter in the credentials for user 1, user 2, or user 3. And as you can see, I have a successful login to LDAP. So Active Directory integration is successful if I can log in using a credential that I've specified in Active Directory. Here are add sync LDAP users, sync LDAP users groups. I find these to be unnecessary, so I wouldn't use them. Instead, I like creating the user on first login as long as I can authenticate to Active Directory. So here we have admin and user 3. As I log out, login as user 1. Logged in fine. My user has been successfully created here. So I'm going to go ahead and conclude at this point. You've successfully integrated Hue with Active Directory. Now it's time to experiment with other forms of integration with Active Directory, integrating Hive Server 2 and Impala authentication, which you've seen in another video, or enabling Kerberos on the entire cluster using Active Directory as well.